friends, it's Risket, and welcome back to another installment of the Deluge video manual, where I'll be showing you pretty much everything I know about using the Synthstrom Deluge. So far in this series, we've gone over everything from the sequencer to song and arranger view, the isomorphic keyboard layout, the effects engine, and even some sampling and audio track stuff. And that brings us finally to diving into the synthesizer engines that are built into the Deluge. Now, there's a few of those in here, but today we're mainly focusing on subtractive synthesis. Now, in very simple terms, subtractive synthesis is the idea of bringing in one or more oscillators and then filtering out the sounds and applying a few different effects to shape it into something that we want it to be. There are a lot of options available to us when we're creating sounds in the Deluge, and I'm hoping this video is going to cover all of them. So by default, when we turn the Deluge on, we're met with patch 0. But we want to create our own sound. So we need to create a new synth. To do that, I'm going to press Shift and Synth. So by default, that has entered us into the subtractive synth mode. But if you want to double check that or change to a different synth mode, we can press Shift, and located underneath master here, we'll go up to synth mode. We're in subtractive right now. There's also FM and ring mod. Now, there is another synth engine in here, which is the wavetable synth engine, but that lives under the subtractive synth mode because they both behave in relatively similar ways, but we're going to save wavetables for another video. So right now, all we're hearing is a standard oscillator. If we have a look at the third and fourth column here, we can see that we have Oscillator 1 and Oscillator 2 with a bunch of different options nested in those. For example, we can change the current level or volume of Oscillator 1 by pressing Shift and Level. Right now it's set to 50, which is max, but we can turn it down if we want. Also, just keep in mind that we don't keep having to press Shift and one of these shortcuts. We can just hold down on the audition pad and press one of these shortcuts, and it'll bring up the same thing. If we want to exit that, we can see that it's flashing right now, so that means that we're in Oscillator 1 level. If we want to exit that, we'll just tap anywhere else on the grid. So next up on the list, we have Transpose. This allows us to pitch our oscillator up or down. Now, at the moment, we can see that this 0 is flashing. So if we turn that up, it's going to raise it up in different note values. We can go the other way too. However, if we want finer control, we can use the select knob up here. Just turn it once and we'll see that we're on the second 0. So this allows us some finer resolution. Now we're going up in sense. We can go over one more time for even finer control. Now, just to save me resetting all of that, I'm just going to press Shift and Synth again to create a new synth. And we're back to where we started. Now, next up, we have probably the most important part of this, which is type, oscillator type. So I'm going to press Shift and type. So we can see right now that we're on a square wave. Give this a turn to the right. We have analog square wave. So it sounds slightly different, and that's because it's modeled off of an analog square wave. We have saw, analog saw, wave. Now wave stands for wavetable, but we're not going to be going into that in this particular video. We also have sample, so we can actually import a sample into one of these oscillator slots. We also have input, so we can actually have incoming audio acting as the oscillator for this synth sound. So for example, we might have a guitar plugged in here or just something being triggered through the internal microphone, and that can act as the input. We also have sine and triangle. And now we're back to square wave. Now, just really quickly, because we will be going over a lot of these other features, but I just want to focus on loading in a sample as an oscillator. So I'll press Shift and Type and just scroll back to Sample and press OK. Now that we've done that, how do we actually locate the sample? Well, the way that we do that is press Shift and Browse. It'll say bottom to top because we're loading a sample from the bottom octave to the top octave. I'm going to navigate to my sample library here. And now we can pick our sample. That one sounds really cool. Awesome. So I just quickly want to go over like some of the benefits of using a sample as an oscillator. Right now, it's kind of just like we've loaded a sample in and now we're just playing it like a regular old sample on a synth track. We have all of the options available to us that we explored in the sampling video. So, editing the playback direction of the reverse or the pitch and speed being linked, so on and so forth. What I'd like to do, for this sound is to press Shift and Oscillator 2, and let's bring up the level of a second oscillator. So now we can hear that when the sample stops playing, a square wave continues to play. I might want to go into Shift and Type and change that to a saw wave. Now there's a few other things that we could do here, and we will be going over this in more detail as we go through this video. But for example, I might want to change the volume of oscillator 2 and map that to envelope 2. And I want to change the attack, so that it's further up. And we'll keep everything else as default. Maybe I'll change the attack to be even further. So basically, this is saying that I don't want to hear this second oscillator until my sample has stopped playing. Now, I'm just getting carried away here and having a little bit of fun. Maybe I want to increase the number of voices and detune them slightly. Add in a little bit of reverb and a tiny amount of delay. Awesome. So this is the sound that we've wound up with. That's really awesome. We've essentially combined a sample with an oscillator, and we're having a lot of fun mixing the two together to create something new entirely. It's one thing that I particularly love about the Deluge, that it doesn't just restrict you to just building sounds from scratch using stock oscillators, but it really allows you to get creative with samples and mixing those two things together, or mixing in live incoming audio to build off of that. Now I'm just going to press Shift and Synth to reset it back to where we were. Now on that note, that also means that you're not exactly limited to the stock oscillator wave types, like your sine wave and your triangle wave and so on and so forth. That means that you can load in single cycle waveforms. So feel free to go online and just download a massive pack of single cycle waveforms, and you can load them straight into the oscillators and start manipulating them that way. They're basically very tiny split second waveforms that you can loop continuously and then start to manipulate into different sounds. Now the wavetable engine in the Deluge, which is only a recent addition, actually handles single cycle waveforms a lot better, but it's just some food for thought. Now, if we go up from here, we can see that we have PW. That stands for pulse width or pulse width modulation. If I were to increase this, for example, on a square wave, we're going to hear that the sound changes. Now, pulse width modulation is a little bit hard to explain, but thinking of a basic square wave, what pulse width modulation is doing is adjusting the amount of time in between each cycle of that square wave sort of looping before the voltage drops from maximum to minimum. I've been doing my best to include some graphic representations of some of these concepts in previous videos, so I'll do my best to include one up here for this sound. Let's turn this back to 0. Either way, don't get too hung up on what pulse width modulation is or what a lot of these things are. I think that it's best to try and understand these concepts to the best of your ability, and if you don't understand them, feel free to go online because a lot of these same principles apply to other synthesizers as well. But use your ears. I think that's one thing that the Deluge really excels at with its sort of minimal menu system. It encourages you to use your ears. If you think something sounds really cool or that it's going to work well in the song that you're producing, go ahead and use it. If you think that pulse width modulation sounds really cool, I encourage you to use it as well. Next up, we have Retrig phase. So what I'm going to do for this is turn up a second oscillator. Great, so now we have two square waves playing at the same time. If I press this over and over again, you might hear a difference in sound every time the note is triggered. Have a quick listen. Even on that last hit, no sound played at all. And basically what's happening is these two oscillators are exactly the same and they're cancelling each other out. That's where something like retrig phase can really be useful to you. If we press shift retrig phase for this second one, we can see that's off. So let's just have a listen to it off again, and then we'll change it. Great, let's turn this. Now it's mostly sounding the same. It's hard for me to give you a good example of what retrig phase is doing, but it's essentially just allowing you to change the degrees that the oscillator will be reset when the note is switched on. Now, I find, especially when we get to the FM synthesis video, having two oscillators, which are two sine waves playing side by side, can tend to sometimes cancel each other out, and you might get audible pops when you're like sort of bringing in some audio. So that's when retrig phase, just sort of offsetting things slightly, can be really, really helpful at combating those issues. Just as a quick example, I'm just going to press shift and synth again. And don't get too hung up on this, but I'm just going to change the synth mode to FM. Great. So we're hearing a sine wave, and I hope that all the mobile viewers out there can hear this. Now, basically, at the start of that sine wave, I'm hearing an audible pop, like a little click in the audio level. Now, there's a couple of things that we could do to change this. Obviously, we could increase the attack slightly. Definitely helps, but if we still wanted our attack to be at 0, doing something like changing the retrig phase is also going to help with that. And there we go, it's mostly gone. I'm going to press shift and synth to start a new synth again. Now above retrig phase, we also have feedback. Feedback, however, is reserved only for the FM synth. So if we press feedback, it's just going to say can't. There is a wavetable button, so this allows you to load your wavetables in if you have selected the wavetable option in the synth type. But again, if we press those, it says can't. Now, right at the very top here, we have Oscillator Sync. So this essentially syncs both oscillators together and sets the retrig phase to be the same for oscillator 2 and 1. So if we bring in a second oscillator here, great. Let's transpose one just so that we can hear the difference. And I'll turn on Oscillator Sync. So if we were to go back and press Transpose, it's like the oscillators are kind of glued together. We're still able to transpose things, but they're kind of more in sync with one another. So if we make sure that the second oscillator is pitched down 1 octave, and we go into Oscillator Sync, and we turn it off, it's going to sound like that. Now finally, there's also a third oscillator at play here. However, it works slightly differently than the other two. Basically up here, we have a noise oscillator. So let's press Shift to Noise and turn that up. Now, you may be wondering why you would ever want a noise oscillator in there. Well, basically, you can get some really unique and interesting textures depending on sort of how you modulate the noise oscillator and how you filter it down as well. So if we were to change the filter of this, maybe I'll just quickly turn off the other oscillators here. Great. So if we were to change the frequency cutoff, use this to simulate wind, for example. There's a lot of different things that you can do with the noise oscillator. One thing I really like to do, and I've demonstrated this in a couple of my videos before, is I like to sort of enter in a note everywhere, and I change the sustain to be off. And we will be going over this envelope section in a bit more details very soon, but for now, I'm just going to set the decay to be really short. So at the moment, our sound sounds like this. Great. One thing we could do is set the noise to be modulated by, I don't know, the random parameter, and we'll turn this all the way up. So now basically the level of this noise is going to be changed randomly. Now, if we were to go back into song mode and start a new kit, now we've entered a really interesting hi-hat rhythm that's just going to continue to change randomly over time. We could even go in and modulate the decay with an LFO so that the decay is getting longer over time. So yeah, lots of really interesting and creative things you can do there. I'm just going to press Shift and New to start a new project. And now I'll press Shift and Synth to start a new synth. Now that pretty much covers a lot of the oscillator section here. However, we're not done yet. We still have a few extra controls up our sleeves. So if we go all the way from oscillator over here to master, we get a few different parameters in these 2 rows here. So we've already gone over what synth mode is. We can press Shift and pan, and that's going to pan our oscillator to the left or to the right. Now, right now, you're not going to hear anything like that because I'm just recording the Deluge output in mono. But if you want your sound to be hanging out to the left or the right for whatever reason, that's something you might want to do. We also have Vibrato, which is going to modulate the pitch, and it uses the speed of LFO1 to do that. And if you're still a bit unsure about how LFOs and the sort of other modulation options work, feel free to jump back and have a look at the effects video in this series. For now, I'll start to turn vibrato up. We can go really crazy with it. I personally like a very subtle bit of vibrato. Now, if you wanted to change the speed of that, as I said, we could go into LFO1 over here. And if we just press this bottom option, we can start to change the speed. If you wanted to sync that with the clock, we could go to sync. And maybe we want that to happen on every fourth note. If we go to turn on our metronome and hit play, you'll notice that it's now rising and falling in time with our metronome. We could change this to be something else. Eighth notes. So yeah, lots of fun to be had with the vibrato. Now underneath here, we also have a master transpose option. So for example, if I introduced a second oscillator here, and I'm just going to pitch the second one down, and maybe I'll pitch the first one up an octave. Great, real organ sound. So if we wanted to shift both of those up or down simultaneously, we can press shift and transpose underneath the master column. And now it's not going to change the spacing or the transposition we've done on these two oscillators. It's just going to transpose the whole thing up or down. Just going to press shift and synth again, keep going back to this original default patch. And obviously it goes without saying, but we also have master level. So if we press that, we're just changing the overall level of this. Now by default, it's at 40, and we can see that this is flashing, and so is our velocity and aftertouch modulation options. Those only come into play if you have a velocity sensitive keyboard plugged into it. We're not doing that in this video. That'll be saved for later on. But for now, just know that that is there. Now, something else that's really fun, if we look over here, we can see the word unison, and there's two options here, number and detune. This is a really fun way to make your sound absolutely huge. So let's have a bit of a listen. If we press number, at the moment it's set to 1. So we're just hearing one voice every time we press a note. But we can turn up the amount of voices all the way to 8. Let's choose 4, for example. Cool. So our sound's starting to sound a little different. Let's just hold down a chord. So we're not really hearing much hugeness at this stage, and that's just my way of talking about it. But basically, if we go into the detune settings, we can detune these voices. So instead of having just 4 voices playing perfectly away from each other, we can slightly shift them. That little bit of dissonance can start making a sound really massive. So let's do that. If we go down a couple of octaves, this can sound really good in bass. Let's introduce a second oscillator. And we'll transpose it down. We could increase the pulse width. Cool. So there's a lot that you could do to start building up this sound, changing some of the filter settings and whatnot. But yeah, Unison's a really fun way to sort of throw a lot more in. Earlier you saw me bring in a sample and then add in a sine wave. That sine wave didn't really sound that good on its own, just coming out of that sample. And that's why I added in a bit more voices and detuned them slightly. And suddenly it fit really well with the rest of the sound. We throw a bit of reverb on this, for example, make it really large. Sounds really cool. So underneath that, we can see that we have some voice options: priority, polyphony, and porta, which is portamento. So basically, priority is set to medium by default, and we also have high and low values. Essentially, what this is doing is telling the Deluge that this sound has a medium priority. So if your project gets really CPU heavy, let's say you have a lot of things going on, eventually the Deluge's CPU is not going to be able to handle it all, and it starts dropping sounds. Now, if this sound is really important to you, and it's a key factor of your song, and you don't want it to disappear, you want to set that priority to high. And basically, the Deluge is going to allow that to sort of come first before it starts dropping anything else. And you could do that for other sounds like low and medium. So it's just good to know that you have a little bit of say in what the Deluge does and doesn't do if it starts getting a little bit, frustrated with the size of your project. Underneath that, we have some polyphony options. Let's go through these one by one. So poly stands for polyphonic, and that means that you can play multiple notes simultaneously, such as when you're playing chords or complex arpeggios. Monophonic, however, which is mono, allows you to only play single notes at a time. It's really good, especially if you're doing bass sounds. It's very rare that you want like two bass sounds from one, if you had a bass guitar, for example, you're usually just playing one note at a time. You don't really want to be striking two notes. But yeah, have a listen. Let's turn my reverb off, sorry. So we can hear that every time I enter in another note, it cuts the old one off. I cannot play a chord like this. Now I'm just going to press Shift and U to create a new synth to demonstrate legato properly. So we've gone over polyphony, the chords. Mono will play one single note at a time. Now have a look at what's happening in mono. So yeah, only one note at a time. Let's switch on legato. Now legato essentially acts just like mono does. You can only play one note at a time. However, let's change a few parameters of the envelope to see what happens. So for example, I'm going to drop the sustain all the way down. And maybe I'll just raise the decay up a fair bit. Maybe not that high. Great, so we can hear that our sound is decaying slowly over time in volume. If I were to switch on the isomorphic keyboard, for example, you can hear that every time I trigger a new note, it's still following the original envelope of the first triggered note. So let's have a listen. Now I can't hear anything because we're still holding down the first note. I can press any other note. There we go. So we can hear that as long as we're holding down an initially triggered note, every note we enter after that is going to still fall under the same envelope as that initial note. This is really, really good if you're trying to synthesize sounds like woodwind instruments, trumpets and such. But yeah, it's really fun to mess around with. So again, I'm going to press Shift and Synth to start a new synth. Finally, under the polyphony menu, we also have auto. Basically, auto is going to act as a mono synth just to save on some CPU until we enter in more notes, and then it'll switch to be polyphonic. So you're not really going to hear much difference. It's basically just being mono until you need it to be polyphonic and then switching back to mono again. It's also worth noting that when we're in a drum kit, we get access to another option, which is the choke groups that I demonstrated in the sample video, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Finally, at the bottom here, we have Porta, which stands for Portamento, and this is enabling notes to glide into one another. So right now, we get this sound, but if we increase this, we'll hear these notes slide into one another. Really good example, we'll just lay down a few notes here. And maybe I'll switch this to be mono because that's going to sound terrible. And let's increase. Get rid of a couple of notes. So yeah, lots of fun to be had there. So just using those oscillator features alone and all of the voice features you have available to you, mixing them with a lot of the effects that we went over in the effects video, as well as the modulation effects, you have a massive palette of creativity laying before you where you can essentially create any sound that you want from scratch. And it should be worth noting that a lot of synthesizers behave the same. Yeah, this one only has 2 oscillators and maybe other synthesizers have more. But you can find a lot of synth recipes online for a lot of the favorite sounds that you might have heard on different albums over the years, or just, you know, it's a really fun way to dive in and start having a lot of fun creating things from scratch. Let's quickly go over how envelopes work. Now, I did touch lightly on this in the effects video, but I left out how decay and sustain works. And I've used them enough by now that I should have probably mentioned these earlier. But let's quickly go over it. I'll press Shift and Synth. We have a new synth. Great. So right now we have envelope 1, and there is also envelope 2 here. So let's increase the attack of envelope 1. Increasing the attack means that the sound will take longer to reach its full volume. It's also worth mentioning that we have quick access to the attack knob up here and also the release knob. Next up, we have decay. So decay is how long it takes for the full volume of the sound that the attack level reached to settle back down into the sustain level. I'm going to try and include a little graphic up the top or to the side here to help demonstrate this. But basically, if we were to set the sustain to be a very low value that we can barely hear, maybe about 15, and we change the decay, you'll hear that the attack rises up to full volume and then slowly falls back down to reach the sustain level. Let's make it a little bit longer. Let's make it really quick. So we're getting that really sharp whum, whum. Great. Let's increase the sustain just a little bit and we'll go over release. Release is essentially how long your sound will continue to play out until it reaches 0 in volume after you have let go of the note. So right now, as soon as I let go, we're not really hearing anything. Let's increase it. So yeah, it's also worth noting that we have a second envelope here, and we have in the modulation sources up here, envelope 1 and envelope 2. So this allows us to map different things to different envelopes and sort of have a bit more control over them over time. Let's start a new synth, for example. I'm just going to change this synth type to be a sine wave. And maybe we'll increase the pulse width just a little bit. Let's go up an octave. Great. I'm going to increase the attack slightly. as well as the release. Great. So using the second envelope, let's say I wanted a little bit of noise to sort of fade in over time as I'm holding down those chords. I'm going to hit noise. We'll turn up the level of this and let's have a listen. Maybe not too loud. Great. So with noise still selected, let's tap Shift and Envelope 2. Now you can see that noise is blinking slowly and it is being routed to Envelope 2. Let's increase this all the way. Great. So now we can edit the parameters of Envelope 2 to have that sound come in a little bit later than our initial sine wave sound. Let's increase the attack. I'll turn down the sustain. Maybe up the release a little bit and have the decay where it is. Let's just have a listen. Great. We want to increase the decay a little bit more. Cool. Maybe we'll just turn down the connection a little bit so it's not getting too full volume. Subtle. Now that decay is taking a little longer than I want it to. Just turn this back up. Great. I'm just going to filter the sound down a little bit and turn up the release a little bit more. So yeah, now it sounds like we've got little waves coming in every time we trigger a chord. Now, obviously, we don't have to just modulate things using the envelopes. We could have used the LFO for that to get a little bit more randomness and whatnot. But that's just one way that you might consider using the envelopes. Another thing that you could do is I've just pressed Shift and Synth to start a new synth. We could map the Transpose control to Envelope 2. Great. And now if we edit the envelope's parameters, just change the decay. Cool, so now we're getting like a little bit of a slide down into our note every time we trigger it. Let's change the transpose for this. Maybe we'll change the type to a sine wave. Yeah, so what I'm doing here is kind of just trying to give you a little bit of an example of different ways that you can route things and set things up, because you could essentially go ahead and synthesize whatever sound you wanted and use all of these controls to build things like drum kits or particular sounding synths that you've heard before, plucked instruments, horns, loads of different things can be made using these engines. And don't forget, just press Shift Synth again. If we were to, for example, we'll modulate the pulse width of this with LFO 1. Great. Just don't forget that we can set custom controls for these. So right now, if I were to just go to custom 2 and 3 down the end here, we'll hold, we'll press Shift and LFO 1. And we'll hold learn and input and give one of these knobs a twist. And now we can access that parameter at any time using custom 3's knob. I'm going to press Shift and Synth again. And let's quickly talk about the Arpeggiator. Now, I thought about putting the Arpeggiator in the effects video because it kind of Kind of is an effect in a way, but I thought it best to leave to the synth video because I mostly use it when I'm creating synth sounds. So let's have a look at some of the options we have. I'm going to enter in Arpeggiator mode, and we have a few options here. Up, which means the Arpeggiator is going to go up and retrigger. If I hold down a chord here, we can hear that it's moving up. If we switch this to down, you'll hear it going down. Both is going to go up and down. And random is just going to do its own thing. I actually use random a lot when I can't really come up with any melody and stuff and I can't be bothered. I just switch the arpeggiator on and set it to random. I'm just going to switch it back to up for now. And let's have a look at the octave control. So right now we're going up and down in 2 octaves. We could switch it back to 1 if we wanted to. It's basically just cycling between these 3 notes that I'm pressing. If we switch it to 2, it's going through these 3 notes and those 3 notes in the next octave above. And that's why we're hearing 6 different notes as that plays. If we switch this to 3, it's going to repeat. And we can do this all the way up to 8 octaves. And we can't even hear the 8th octave because we're already at middle C, so we'll just turn this down a little bit. Yeah. Next up we have gate. This is sort of a percentage value of how much available time the arpeggiator notes fill in. So let's adjust this and have a bit of a listen. Oh, sorry, I'll set the octave back to just be 2. So with it turned up all the way, there's not really many gaps in between these sounds. But if we were to turn it down, almost dotted. So I would, if you're trying to get your head around this, I would consider this as almost like the decay of sort of each block of the arpeggiator over time. Next up we have sync. So right now it's playing at 16th notes, but we could change this to be 32nd notes. And remember, we can still continue to edit the gate. And if we set it to off, we can just change the arpeggiator rate by pressing Shift and Rate down the bottom here, and just set it to a rate that we want. Now again, don't forget that we can map this to a custom control, for example, by holding Learn and giving this knob a twist. If we lay a chord down, we could even take it one step further and press Shift, Arpeggiator Rate, and then map that to an LFO. Great. And then maybe we want to press Shift LFO Rate and learn that to this top knob. And now we can get some really interesting results. So that essentially covers the arpeggiator and how it works. It's going to start a new synth and we'll get rid of those notes. All right, so right now we are in a synth track, but don't forget that we don't actually just have to make synth sounds using the synth tracks. We can switch to a kit track and put synth sounds in each one of these clip rows. Now, obviously, we're not going to be able to play it, up and down the octaves the way that we would in a synth track, but it allows us some other options. So for example, I'm going to press Shift and Kit, and instead of loading in a sample, I'm just going to press back. So now what I'm going to do is go into Shift and Type, and instead of having sample, let's change it to something like a sine wave. Great. Increase the pulse width a little. And we'll introduce a second oscillator. And maybe we'll change this type to also, maybe we'll make it a saw wave. Great. Turn the level of that down a little bit. Cool. So, we could go from here and try and synthesize our own drum sounds. Why would you want to do this? Well, obviously, being able to set up different custom controls and whatnot for individual kit rows if you're building a drum track is going to offer you like a lot of different creative control, be it from a sound design perspective and also from a performance perspective. I'm definitely planning on releasing a video, probably somewhere in the workflow stage, on how to synthesize your own drum kit and why you might want to do that, because it's really, really fun to do. And it's also a good sound design exercise as well. It can teach you a lot about synthesis. So, from here, let's just transpose this oscillator up. And we'll change the transpose to be mapped to envelope 2. Great, let's change the decay of envelope 2. And we'll turn that pulse width off. Great, let's turn the sustain all the way down of this sound. And change the decay. Great. Now we'll transpose our first oscillator back down an octave. And we'll add on a bit of saturation. Cool. Let's filter this. And we'll change it to the dry filter. Awesome. Not perfect. I'm really rushing this, but that's essentially we're making a kit drum. Yeah, sounds awful, I know, but you get the idea. We could even go to this one and we'll press New. And instead of loading up a sample, we'll just jump all the way back and we'll change this oscillator type. Actually, let's just leave the oscillator type. We'll just turn on the noise oscillator. Great. We'll turn sustain all the way down. Cool. And maybe we do want to, let's introduce a sine wave again. And we'll just transpose it up so that we can hear it. We'll map that to envelope 2. And we'll decrease the decay. And transpose that back down. And we'll just drop the level of that a little. Finally, let's make a quick hi-hat. We'll do what we did earlier. We'll just press New, jump all the way back here, turn on the noise oscillator, and we'll map it to random. And let's change the sustain to be off and the decay to be almost closed. Awesome. So pretty basic. I'm hoping that when I get up to the workflow video, I can really show you a lot of useful ways to synthesize your own sounds and make them sound good, but you get the idea. Now we're loading in synthesizers into individual kit rows. That affords us a lot of creative opportunities. Let's say, for example, on the kick drum, I wanted to map the pulse width modulation of Oscillator 1 to custom 3. I'll learn that, and there we go. We could just swivel this knob and record it. Let's say that maybe over time I wanted to modulate the decay of the hi-hat. So we'll go shift decay, go learn, and we'll twist this knob. And let's record something in. You get the idea. So I'm pretty sure that's everything I have to say about subtractive synthesis for now. So I hope that you all enjoyed that and that you found it useful. In the next video, we're going to be jumping straight into FM synthesis. And I think a lot of people get really scared off by FM synthesis because, I've used a few FM synths before and they all kind of approach it slightly differently, but it's, mostly like subtractive synthesis, mostly the same sort of principles, just worked around a little bit differently. I personally had a hard time getting into FM synthesis on the Deluge. I'd used Operator, a synth in Ableton, an awful lot and really got my head around that in a good way. But using it on the Deluge was a bit tricky. It's not as probably robust as other FM synths, but after fiddling around with it for a while, I finally got my head around how it works and how to set up all of your own algorithms with it. And you can make a lot of really, really cool sounds with the FM synth in the Deluge. So definitely stay tuned for the next one. Hit the like if you like, and if you don't, tell me why. Please subscribe, and I'll see you in that next one. Cheers.